Okay, I think I'm comfortable with this quorum. Alejandro, are you ready to begin?
Yeah, I'm ready to read. I just realized maybe you thought I was going to play the recording too. I can do that, but I haven't tried that before. So,
Well, why don't you?
But if I'm the guy to try it, I'll try.
Why don't you just read? So, just by way of introduction, I guess, and we can bracket this conversation. This space is about the second chapter of Kostin Alamaru's Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. The second chapter is called The Idea of Nature in Pindar, or is it? Yes, The Idea of Nature in Pindar, an archaic Greek choral poet. And we thought that to give this poet is somewhat obscure to most people. We thought that the best thing to do to give everyone maybe a little flavor of what this poetry is like, at least in English translation, is to just read one of the odes. And so that's how Alejandro will begin this space, and then we will move into the discussion of Kostin's chapter.
All right. I actually, since we talked about this, playing the recording, and I think it would be nice, I'm going to try to play this. I know a lot of guys play music. I just never tried it before. But let me try playing here the first Pythic ode, and hopefully it'll sound okay. And then I'll do the reading.
Incredible. And Alejandro, do you want to read that ode or another ode of your selection in English translation?
Yeah, so that, by the way, was the first Pythic ode performed by Petros Tabouris. And now I'm going to read C.M. Bora's translation of the first Olympian. This is one of these. This is actually the first one that is discussed by Costin in the chapter. And Costin does his own translation, so there's an excerpt in there that he talks about. But I thought it was worth it hearing the whole poem and having a broader sense of how the material he's most interested in is embedded. So Olympian 1 for Hieron of Syracuse, winner in the horse race. Yes, Ancient is reminding me that Pindar is impossible to translate. I'm sharing this to prompt appreciation and excitement, not to claim this is, and in any sense, a replacement. Okay. Water is the best thing of all, and gold shines like flaming fire at night, more than all a great man's wealth. But if, my heart, you would speak of prizes won in the games, look no more for another bright star by day in the empty sky, more warming than the sun, nor shall we name any gathering greater than the Olympian. The glorious song of it is clothed by the wits of the wise. They sing aloud of Cronus' son, when they come to the rich and happy hearth of Hieron, who sways the scepter of law in Sicily's rich sheep pasture. He gathers the buds of all perfections, and his splendor shines in the festal music, like our own merry songs when we gather often around that table of friends. But take down from its peg the Dorian lute, if surely the beauty of Pisa, the beauty of Pherenikos, loaded our hearts with the sweetest thoughts, when by Alpheus you raced past, giving his strength in the course, not waiting for the spur, and brought to triumph his master. The king of Syracuse, the soldier horseman, his fame is bright in the great assembly of men, which Lydian Pelops founded, he with whom the mighty earth-shaker Poseidon fell in love, when Clotho lifted him out of the cleansing cauldron, when his shoulder of ivory, white and fine. There are many wonders, and it may be embroidered tales overpass the true account and trick men's talk with their enrichment of lies. Beauty, who creates all sweet delights for men, brings honor at will, and makes the false seem true time and again. But the wisest witness of all are the days to come. Let a man speak good of the gods, and his blame shall be less. Son of Tantalus, in my tale of you I shall counter the poets before me, when your father called his companions to his most innocent banquet into Sipylus' home, making the gods his guests who had made him theirs. Then the bright Triton's god lost his heart for love of you, and seized you, and carried you on his golden mares to the high house of wide-worshipped Zeus, where later in time Ganymedes came also for the same service to Zeus. When you were no more seen, and men searched long, but brought you not home to your mother, then some envious neighbor told the tale in secret, that the water bubbled over the fire, and they sliced you into it, limb by limb, with a knife. Then at the second course of the feast, they portioned the meat of your body and ate. I cannot say, not I, that any blessed god has a gluttonous belly. I stand aside. Those who speak evil have troubles thick upon them, and if the watchers on Olympus ever showered honor to a mortal man, Tantalus was he. And yet his stomach could not hold such mighty fortune. He came to huge mischief, a mighty rock which the Father hung over him, and longing always to cast it from his head, he is exiled from delight. Without strength he lives in eternal trouble, and has with 3 torments a fourth, because he stole and gave to his companions who drank with him the gods' nectar and ambrosia with which they made him immortal. The man who thinks that he will do anything, and God not see, is wrong. Therefore the immortals thrust back his son among men to whom death comes soon. And when he came to the sweet flower of his growth, and down covered his darkening chin, he lifted his thoughts to a bridal awaiting him, to have far-famed Hippodamia
from her Poseidon father. He went down beside the grey sea in the darkness alone and cried to the loud bellowing Lord of the Trident. And the god was with him, close beside his feet, and Pelops said, "If the dear love you had of me, Poseidon, can turn, I pray, to good, keep fast now the brazen spear of Oinomaios, and on the swiftest chariots carry me to Elis and bring me to victory, for he has slain 13 men that wooed her, and puts back the bridal day of his daughter. The danger is great and calls not the coward, but of us who must die, why should a man sit in darkness and cherish to no end an old age without a name, letting go all lovely things? For me this ordeal waits, and you, give me the issue I desire." So he spoke, and the prayer he made was not unanswered. The god glorified him and gave him a chariot of gold and winged horses that never tired. So he brought down the strength of Oinomaios and the maiden to share his bed. She bore him princes, 6 sons, very eager in nobleness, and now, by the ford of Alpheus, he is drenched in the glorious blood offerings, with a busy tomb beside that altar where strangers throng past number. The fame of the Olympiads and the games of Pelops overlooks the wide earth. There a man's strong prime endures its toils, and the victor all his remaining days breathes a delicious and serene air. When he remembers the games, and yet these good things that come with each day as it comes are still the best of all for all men, I must crown the victor with the horseman's tune in my Aeolian melody. I know well there is no friend of strangers among men alive greater than he, whether in knowledge of all good things or in power, for me to enrich in the splendid folds of song. God is your guardian, Hieron. He charges himself with this and watches over all your cares. And if he desert you not soon, I hope to find a sweeter path even, and to join with a swift chariot in giving you glory, when I come along the path that awakens speech to Cronus' hill standing in the sun. The muse is nursing for me a javelin, marvelously valiant and strong. One man is great in this way, another in that. But at the peak of all are kings. Look no farther than this. I pray you may walk exalted all these days of your life, and may I so long keep company with victors, a beacon light of song among the Hellenes everywhere.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much, Alejandro. Yeah, so the things I noticed from that poem, are just this praise of the athlete, the winner, his glorious lineage, a telling of a complex myth of the founding of a race of heroes, perhaps a warning in the myth of Tantalus for Hieron not to overstep his bounds or to be too overweening in his pride. There are often warnings in these odes to the victors to remember that even in their moment of glory, not to bring the envy of the gods upon them. In any case, why don't we move to the discussion of the chapter? Alejandro, in our group chat, you laid out sort of a basic outline of how the chapter works. Costin has also given this in this sort of sketch outline in the organization of the sections of the chapter. But basically, this chapter is really about the concept of physis, which is actually the Greek word that gives us our English word physics. It's often translated as nature, but as Costin shows, in Pindar it has a very sort of elaborate, multivalent use. It has these sort of very complex nuances that I think will come out in the course of our discussion. He begins by talking about physis simply as the body, or stature, or growth. Then later, there's a section about physis as heredity and blood itself. perhaps something inside or behind the body of an individual that belongs more properly to a clan or a family or a lineage. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit about Physis and Heredity as opposed to Nomos. Maybe I'll just have one other sort of introductory kind of thing to say here quickly, which is just that there's a really interesting point made on page 118. I think there was a question in our last space about the first chapter about sort of the difference between Nomos, which Costin talked about as the sort of the rule of ancestral custom and received wisdom, and Physis, which is sort of the study of nature. And of course, someone brought up the fact that of course these aristocrats, this worldview that's expressed in the Odes of Pindar, certainly they too have their own ancestral customs. They have their own received wisdom, their own unquestioned laws and values, and the way that they live their life. One of the distinctions that Costin draws that I think is really pertinent to our discussion of Pindar, the athletic games, and selective breeding in general, is here. He says, I'll just read beginning at the bottom of page 118. He says, aristocratic traditions and conventions point in a way to something above and outside the mere preservation of a tribal collectivity. That is to say, aristocratic traditions are distinguished from the traditions of the commons or of a primitive egalitarian tribe by the fact that these traditions consist of a breeding and training regime, to be understood in both cases quite literally. And then this key sentence, the purpose of this regime of breeding and training is the production of a specimen that biologically embodies arete, excellence, and possesses contempt for death as well as for mere life. Whereas, by contrast, the nomos of the subject population, the people who are being ruled by this aristocracy, the nomos of the subject population and of all, quote, default populations whatsoever, is entirely directed to the preservation of mere life. So the way of the aristocrat is to produce the specimen that embodies excellence, whereas the nomos of the egalitarian tribal village is directed for the preservation of mere life. Spurgler.
Yes, and can you hear me?
Yes.
I think you can. Okay, and he puts it, I think, even simpler on that same page, kind of earlier. He says, indeed, part of aristocracy's claim to rule is that its members are the most faithful preservers of ancient customs, genealogies, esoteric religions, and so on. I thought that was very interesting, where he was also making the connection between Achilles and Agamemnon, saying that Agamemnon and his kind of role as king is kind of referring back to Costin's analysis in the first chapter, where he kind of mentions the role of like the sort of weak sacral king who kind of is just basically there as a figurehead to kind of uphold these the laws of what does he call it, the gynogerontocracy or whatever exactly it is. I thought that was a very interesting way of reading kind of this opposition between Achilles and Agamemnon. Agamemnon is a kind of a stand-in for Nomos.
Yes, and for those who recall, there are only two uses of the word Physis in Homer, and one of the most interesting uses has to do with the sort of the scepter of nature, if you will, that Achilles swears by, whereas Agamemnon possesses the king's scepter of sort of he's king by convention because he commands the most men. Achilles swears on a sprouting branch. That's his scepter. This in Costine takes this to be the contrast of sort of the naturally excellent versus merely the conventional authority. Yes, Alejandro.
I just wanted to say a note to make the connection in case it wasn't clear to the listener. So why, if this is the general schema, what are we talking about here? Why are we talking about Pindar? And so maybe one way to get into this is just to say that Alemario uses Pindar's poetry not in the sense that somehow Pindar would be like a philosopher arguing about a notion of physis or presenting it in contradistinction to others, but it's rather a kind of record of a way of thinking and maybe better put, a way of life of archaic Greece, right? That was already old in Pindar's time, but right, that Pindar remembers and celebrates. And precisely, you could hear that in the poem I read, that the celebration in the present of the achievement of the athlete is done through all of this sort of retelling of different relevant bits and pieces of mythology and so on. So there is a kind of record in Pindar that's being accessed, and that's why, and specifically based on his use of physis, right? But there's a larger picture that this sits within, that the poetry unfolds.
Yes. So the worldview that Pindar expresses, where the excellence of the athlete is intimately connected, if not literally the same thing as the favor of the gods shown on various mythological heroes. This worldview is expressed, maybe we could say naively or something like that, or wholeheartedly. It's fully revealed, whereas this sort of natural order has to go underground in the philosophy of Plato. This is Costine's argument. Spergler.
Yeah, I want to emphasize how important what Alejandro pointed out was, because I think it's just so important for Costine's argument here. Like in terms of like the methodology he's kind of employing to really make the argument, it's this kind of like quasi anthropologist like interpretivism where like you really have to steep yourself in like the customs and the poetry of these people to understand not just what they mean, but what they mean on their own terms in some sense. So I think that's especially like interesting to see in like a thesis on the classics. This isn't like some sort of Clifford Geertz piece where he's trying to like understand the significance of some sort of like what is it, Balinese cockfighting or whatever. But he's applying this sort of anthropological like lens to the Greeks, which is just really interesting, and it makes it like a lot of fun as well. And I think in some sense it's refreshing because it's, I don't know, like you're just treating like the Greeks just like a normal kind of population and just trying to understand them on their own terms. And perhaps some connections can be made to just how important anthropology itself is for Costine all throughout this. I mean, like the first chapter was extremely heavy on, taking some anthropology from other pastoralist societies, like the Tutsis, for example.
Yes, that's quite helpful. Let's move to the discussion of Physis as the body. I will read a few sentences from this chapter, beginning at the bottom of page 122, and then perhaps Alejandro, Upcountry, Spergler, you can offer your comments. Let's just say, so I'm reading now, but there is one fundamental meaning we can be sure of. Nature, physis, phui, refers first of all and always and above all to a concrete material reality, to a biological reality that means very plainly the body. And this meaning should never, and all future refinements of the definition of nature be forgotten or abstracted away from. All later attempts to further understand Physis in intellectualized or philosophical form, for example, as essence and so on, or even as heredity or inborn character, may or may not be legitimate. But whatever other meaning this word will be shown to carry, and indeed it does carry further meaning, it always also means a concrete body, flesh and blood, a biological entity. And then on page 124, I believe speaking about the first Olympian ode, Costin goes on to say, in retelling the myth of Pelops, Pindar writes of the time, quote, when he blossomed with the stature of fair youth and down darkened his cheek. Costin goes on to say that, of course, of fair youth, these words are added, and the word stature is meant to translate the word physis. Yes, I think I'll end there for now. Alejandro Spergler, Upcountry, please.
I'll just make a brief remark here. I think that what could distinguish here a general claim and then a more specific claim. The general claim, which I think is really solid and worth keeping in mind, really with respect to anything that becomes a technical term in philosophy, is that it's almost axiomatic that the more concrete meanings of words are historically earlier, and they have to be adapted through metaphor, through analogy, or through some process of abstraction to be able to hold their wider meaning, right? So just to be very schematic here, supposing that the earliest meaning of physis is the body, and then, centuries later, people are arguing about something comparable to our notion of nature at the most abstract level. It's always in that order and not the other way around. That's, I think, the general claim. Then there's a specific claim here about that the original meaning, or the oldest meaning, the most concrete meaning, is the body. There, I think some people will want to argue with him, right? But I think we can still keep these two claims distinct and notice that, to me, the most important is the first, because even if we say, well, maybe it is not exactly the body, maybe it is something like growth or life in a biological sense, we still have something very close and very concrete. The other point, which I think is related to this and goes back to our earlier conversation about the use of Pindar as a kind of witness rather than as someone who's adducing arguments, is that the subtitle of, or actually the second part of the title of the book, is The Birth of Philosophy. And so there is also this notion that we should expect, if what I just said is right, that an argument about the proper meaning of a word, right, and especially an increasingly abstract argument, as you will find in philosophy, should also post-date a more ordinary use. And so like Spergler was saying here, the anthropological, or as Costin says once or twice, phenomenological exploration has to do with getting at what this root stratum of speech was that then became incorporated into philosophy. And of course, this becomes a big deal because the very nature of philosophy becomes a major issue in the third and fourth chapters of the book.
And later we'll see that physis, it stands in for stature or the body, but always in certain contexts, right? This is a blossoming body, that the down of Heron's beard is darkening, right? This is, or should I say, is this Pelops's beard? But Costin goes on to say that, this desire for glory that Pelops has is also related directly to his desire for issue, right? So he prays in the myth retold in Olympian 1, Pelops prays to Poseidon and asks him to give me the issue that I desire. And so there's this sort of mysterious connection between the flourishing and glorified and blossoming body of the athlete and the same force, the same Physis that shines through that body also wants to perpetuate itself and issue in progeny. So Costin writes at the top of page 125, the matter in question, as in the example mentioned before regarding Apollo and Chiron, is in this case one of finding a proper marriage, the issue of which results in a race of heroes, leaders of the people, who are eager for fine deeds that win acclaim. The rest of the passage referring to Pelops' desire to find such a marriage only as part of his search for danger and glory, in which utter contempt for mere life is expressed as a matter of course, is entirely in keeping with the fundamentally aristocratic meaning of nature. That is, this desire for glory comes upon him at the moment of the very blossoming and emergence of his fui, his body, or his nature. And perhaps there's another interesting sentence here on the same theme on page 128. He says, thus again, whenever Phua or any version thereof is mentioned, appears the same fateful connection to the arts of love, to wedlock, breeding, or intercourse. And then later, he's talking about a retelling of Jason praying to Aphrodite in order to seduce Medea. And he says, in both cases, a young adventurer bests an aboriginal king. I hope that sounds familiar to you from the introduction. In both cases, a young adventurer bests an aboriginal king, marries or seduces his daughter, and wins great renown or founds a great line of leaders. Thus we are alerted in both cases to the special and full meaning of Phua, body, nature. It is concrete, material, biological body, and it is much more. In both cases, it seems to have to do with, and this, I have this phrase underlined in my book, it has to do with the emergence of a body in supreme condition into the enduring radiance of fame, of being, and with the perpetuation of a divine bloodline. Spergler.
So here's how I'm reading, I guess, like what Costin is like doing here. So like what we saw in like the first chapter was him essentially kind of outlining like that general, you could even say like archetypal or ideal typical way in which a kind of pastoralist people, imposes itself upon a more sedentary people. And now what he's doing here in this chapter is he's trying to kind of give us the actual specifics, the way in which it actually happened in the case of the Greeks, right? And the way in which these kind of concepts, this opposition of Physis and Nomos is kind of being borne out. And then going back to what you were just reading from, it seems like he's really trying to hammer home this connection between the body and breeding, or Physis and breeding. I mean, it makes a very intuitive sense. I mean, you don't get new bodies without breeding in some way.
Yeah, I actually think it would be great to read a little more right where Charles left off a minute ago. So I'm at the bottom of 128. The following example better illustrates just what kind of body is meant by Phua or Physis, and the relationship of such body indeed not just to blood, but to truth and to being itself. In celebration of a victor of the Pankration, a kind of free-for-all mix of boxing and wrestling, similar to modern mixed martial arts, Pindar praises the winner from his own native Thebes in the following terms. First, after briefly recounting some of the most notable moments of Thebes' glorious past, he says, and now Costin's translation from Pindar, But since ancient grace sleeps and mortals are forgetful of whatever does not reach the highest bloom of skillful song, joined to glorious streams of words, then begin the victory procession with a sweet singing hymn for Strepsiades, for he is the victor in the Pancratium at the Isthmus, both awesome in his strength and handsome to look at. And he treats or holds excellence as not uglier, more shameful, or inferior to body. Costin has a kind of technical translation here where he offers variants. He is made radiant by the violet-haired muses, and he has given a share in his flowering garland to his uncle and namesake, from whom Ares of the bronze shield mixed the cup of destiny. But honor is laid up as recompense for good men. And Costin again, the contrast here made is explicitly between virtue or excellence, areta, on the one hand, and fue on the other. It should be mentioned that many traditional translations of the passage above had rendered fue as beauty, as in, and he holds excellence as no worse a possession than beauty. Okay, and he keeps talking about the translation, but I wanted to point out this interesting remark that even as he is insisting on the initial meaning being the most concrete, you already have this other thread where it is, because it is the body in some exemplary, well, first of all, an exemplary specimen, and second of all, in the athletic match, an exemplary specimen at an exemplary moment. It seems to have somehow, to put it crudely, more truth or more being, or again, as he says, other translators simply opt there for beauty. But what are these various, let's say, words that? Why is it that when we try to talk about the particular singularity of this great specimen at a great moment, we start reaching for these more abstract terms, right? Not that they're there in the poem, but in trying to explain the sense of the word in the poem, he already begins reaching for them.
I mean, wouldn't just like one explanation be that it's just like an inspiring thing to see, like that you think there's something greater at play in it, like there's some sort of almost like idealism operating?
I think so, right? But we could frame it as a kind of like a halo, something that just has a kind of remarkable shininess about it that just stands out. But again, there is no sort of abstraction here, so it seems like the thing that stands out as somehow more special actually is more special. And if we're going, right, there is a passage, I think you actually tweeted it earlier, Spergler. I don't remember quite where it is in the chapter, about a kind of superior
It's
reality.
right at the end, right at the end of part 2 of this chapter.
Okay. Do you want to preview it now, since we're kind of on the topic?
Yeah, sure. If let's see where, I don't know where you want to start because it's a bit long. Do you want me to do the whole thing, or? Okay.
Maybe just kind of talk through the idea and read the.
Okay, well, he seems like he's saying, but this immediately reminded me of the BAP tweet, like Hercules existed, but you don't. And the idea being that some are more real than others. Okay, I'm just going to read this here. So he's talking about how most people are forgetful of great deeds. I'm reading now. They live in darkness, forgetting, for they themselves are dim and dark, ignorant or envious. Their envy and ignorance covers up reality. They cover up reality under a stream of falsehoods and words. Real men, Andres, have being or have more being. They have reverence for their being or body and listen to its vehement calling. They can't help but listen or obey in this case. Everywhere in Pindar, there's the elevation of this vehement being, blood or will, silent and effective in real men, extolled and memorialized in splendid songs. And that exists in distinction to the chatter, the word-obsessed envy, the darkness of the many. Bread fua is more real than other bodies, which are shrouded in darkness. These men are apparent and manifest in their great deeds. the watchful eye of the seer, the poet picks these out and preserves the deeds in words to make them apparent, visible through time, to make their fame or being endure. Strepsiades' phua, or intensified reality, is what makes him become, quote, radiant and emerge from a primeval and undifferentiated darkness. This is the truth and reality, and this is nature. This may sound rather impressionistic or high-flown for now, but a further consideration of Pindar's use of the idea of nature will show that the meaning of this word is quite precise, and precisely quite strange and alien for the moderns. And that selection. And what immediately this reminds me of is, so in Norse mythology and in the Vedas, I think, and then also among the Greeks, they all had this kind of term for undying fame. In the Greek, I believe it is kleos aptithon or something like this. I'm not going to get into. I think it's in the Havamal. If anybody knows that quote, it's a really good one about how a dead man's deeds kind of outlive him. And Costin, he's making this opposition, right? Going back earlier in what I just read, their envy and ignorance covers up reality. They cover up reality under a stream of falsehoods and words. And then what's the opposition there is its deeds, something that are much more than just words, but actual physical actions, something that kind of proves, because like you have to kind of manifest this thing, this physis, and you can't just be all talk. And perhaps that's also another reason why, like the agon, the competition is just so important for the Greeks, because it's just this perfect mechanism by which you can kind of force out the physis of kind of like your greatest men in the aristocracy. So this was honestly kind of one of the for me, like one of the kind of the climaxes of the book so far, that passage. I don't know how you guys felt about it.
I'm glad we jumped ahead, because the reference to Strepsiades shows that he was thinking again of that same poem, the last one I read. So I do think that's kind of the full expansion of the idea there.
I would also say, Sprigler, perhaps the agon is not maybe as a mechanism by which we force Physis into the light is not quite right. I would say maybe the agon is the mechanism by which Physis emerges or shows itself or reveals itself, right? This is a part of archaic Greek thought that has always fascinated me. Heidegger talks about this. Maybe Athenian, you can comment later on about this dynamic that the Greeks seem so obsessed with, which is hiding and revealing, concealment and uncovering, darkness and light. There's a way in which the aristocrats breed themselves out of a Stygian obscurity and bring their beautiful bodies into the light. There's a way in which the games provide these moments for Physis to shine forth in a completely undeniable way. And then lastly, we have to observe that Pindar himself associates his own art with this same dynamic of uncovering and revealing, that these deeds may languish in darkness because of the forgetfulness of man, but it's the poet's words that shine another kind of light on them, and preserve them from all for, give them the kleos, or the fame that you were talking about earlier, Sprigler.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a better way of putting it, right? Like the physis is already there, but the agon is the mechanism by which it's kind of revealed. Yes, I like this. This is good. I wanted to very briefly
And the
read
Physis, and specifically the Physis, perhaps having more agency than a modern would think of, right? It's the blood, this vehement or intensified reality pushing through these bodies and manifesting itself in these deeds, right? Beyond sort of, the contingencies of one person's life or one person's decisions or thoughts.
Yeah, at one point he has that discussion of I think it was of the way in which it can kind of skip generations in some way, but the Physis is still kind of there. Like you'll still see like a hint of it, and like it's inborn. I don't know. Do you guys remember that discussion where he's talking about how, like for instance, like height can like skip a generation and whatnot?
Yes, this is in the third section of the chapter, specifically with the Nemean Ode. I was fascinated with this passage myself, even before reading this book. But there's so Pindar often connects the accomplishments of the athlete to their lineage. These aristocratic athletes. Obviously, the sort of this bodily excellence, runs in the family, right? As we should expect, and often there were many crowned, victorious athletes in the families of these dedicatees that Pindar mentions, right? So he'll say, yes, like so and so, you just won this crown, just like your father and your grandfather, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes, in the case of the sixth Nemean Ode, which he begins his discussion of that on page 131. The father of the victor was not a distinguished athlete, and Pindar says, something like, what does he say? Alchemides gives a great sign to be seen that his inborn is like the fruitful fields, which in alternation at one time give men yearly subsistence from the plains, and at another time gather strength from repose. So just like a field will lay fallow for a season and then bear fruit in another season, sometimes this Physis, this inborn reality, flourishes and uncovers itself in one generation and hides itself away in another generation. It has its own rhythm, perhaps independent of the efforts of individuals or something like that.
Yeah, let me just say, with respect to our original kind of plan here, we didn't really announce the shift to the, from nature, Physis as the body, to Physis and body as blood and heredity. But we basically, conversationally, have already sort of gone on to that topic, right? So the flow of the assessment of Pindar goes from those 2 points to then the third, that Physis' heredity is then opposed to Nomos. But maybe we can dwell a little bit more on the specifics of blood and heredity to kind of seal this point. And maybe it just, go ahead.
I was just going to say another sort of gloss on this same idea comes to us in a sentence from page 137. I'm reading now. The default condition of nature, then, is that it lies concealed or dormant, especially in intervening generations, but that it explodes or erupts with irresistible power in the world and impresses itself on the observer with equal violence. In almost every case where Pindar refers to the hereditary and inborn property of nature, there is some reference also to a word indicating manifestation, revelation, the bringing out of something from the forgotten or concealed into the realm of the visible, and so on. Oh, and then
Right.
sorry,
Go ahead.
one more thing that goes back to what Spurgler was saying earlier about Hercules was real, Hercules was real, you are not. On page 136, Costin writes, some beings are, italicized are, some beings are more than others. They have more being, more nature.
Okay, so let me just try to sum up where I think we've gotten so far. Always lose a little bit of the fine grain when you do this, but I think this will help. So if the sort of, let's say, initial observation is of Physis as this property of growth as observed in the body, and the body is the most concrete, the shift to thinking of it as something like blood and heredity is coupled with this notion of the occasional or partial or regular concealment of it. And that's, I think, the bit that you were connecting with, for example, what you find in the way Heraclitus uses the word earlier, Charles. So the in some sense, when it's as though, I mean, you could put it in a kind of historicizing historical vein just by saying, well, I mean, the descendants of the pastoralists would have had some intuitive sense of heredity from their knowledge of animal husbandry and so on, and certainly could notice some of the same patterns in human breeding. But there wasn't anything like a science of heredity or a systematic study of this. So one way to recognize that there did seem to be these continuities, but that there were discontinuities as well, is this kind of idea that is summed up by Heraclitus as that nature loves to hide in one translation, or nature conceals itself somehow. But this, in the Pindar context, is of course the flip side of it, is that then what happens in the athletic competition, at least for the victor, is the sort of amazing revelation of what has up until that point been latent or hidden.
Yes, and there are several places as well where Pindar, and then Costin commenting on Pindar, says that this Physis manifests itself. This he suggests that this kind of this this nature, this inborn quality is of course hereditary, and that's an essential component of arete. But it also takes training. Pindar says that sort of he doesn't really oppose the terms of sort of nature and training, or breeding and training, but he says that it's the aristocratic regime needs both. That athletes who are merely trained are always inferior to those who have this sort of overflowing power, this Physis inside of them, and who are then trained, right? Those are the best athletes.
I liked his kind of description, or I guess this is sort of Pindar's, but whatever. I like that he kind of emphasized the manlet wrestler as being something interesting. That his body didn't necessarily reveal the true nature of his physis or something like this. I'm trying to find it right now, but I thought that was interesting. So going back to this idea of nature or physis as the body, the way in which it's a bit more seemingly complicated, I guess. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on the manlet. I know elsewhere a different author, Bapp, talks about the manlet being the most revolutionary principle of the last few centuries. So I find this is interesting.
Here's a good one on page 140. I'm reading now. Maybe the climax of Pindar's thoughts on nature are revealed in this explicitly negative attitude to teaching the taught, what we might call the tryhards. And then this is Pindar. A man with inborn glory has great weight, but he who has only learned is a man in darkness, breathing changeful purposes, never taking an unwavering step, but trying his hands at countless forms of excellence with his ineffectual thoughts. And then later he says, Pindar writes, that which is inborn or by nature is always the best, but many men strive to win glory with excellence that comes from training. Anything in which a god has no part is none the worse for being quelled in silence, for some roads lead farther than others, and a single occupation will not nourish us all. The paths to skill are steep. He goes on, let's see, yeah, I think I'll stop there. Chiron. Sorry, this, and maybe, and I don't want to get us too far off track or think too far ahead. But when we talk about the builder of athlete, like Pindar often mentions the person who trains the athlete. He calls them out by name in the odes. He'll say sort of like, and you there, the builder of athletes, like, I think in one of the odes, it's a guy from Athens named Menander that has always trained the sons of this one family in the Pancration. But he'll and sometimes it's the older brother who may have also won a crown at the Nemean Games or the Pythian Games or something that helps his younger sibling also win. But I think the teacher, what's taught is what's only taught is inferior to what we might think of as trained or cultivated nature. This bears special relevance later on in the book when we think about the philosopher as the trainer of minds and perhaps also of bodies as well. This person has an important special role. On page 143, Costin writes, Chiron is a teacher of heroes for a reason. He is the ultimate trainer or cultivator or sharpener of inner breeding in nature. So it's interesting to think about this sort of the dialectic or the interplay between breeding and training, not only because training is sort of whether it's weightlifting or hitting punching a bag or whatever it may be, but also the training that the philosopher offers.
So maybe this is a good place to introduce the opposition to Nomos. It was actually almost about to come up there on the passage you read from 141, so I'll just read a little bit farther down from where you left off, Charles. The men who learn only, who seek learned excellences, are men in darkness and silence, men who have not just a different nature, but who have sufficient nature, who have more nature, more reality. So there's that same bit we were talking about earlier, are revealed, become apparent, or emerge to the sight of the seer as if from a primordial and undifferentiated swamp or morass. This is the world of Nomos, the world of the many. It should be clear from Pindar's depreciation of conventional learning or training, as in the phrases, those who have only learned or learned excellence, that by corollary, Nomos itself, whatever utilitarian value it may have in maintaining an illusion of common good or common peace, has no value when it comes to the most important thing, virtue itself. For Nomos stands or falls by teaching, conventional training, inculcation, but it cannot teach virtue, the arts of leadership, physical strength and daring, or wisdom. Indeed, convention likely has a negative value, insofar as it is an expression of collective ignorance and forgetfulness, not privy to the light of truth. This last only emerges as in a flash through Physis, body, blood, biological breeding made apparent through great action. And so it's worth remembering that the sort of general interpretive schema here is that in Pindar's poems, this idea, right, if Costin is interpreting him right, this idea is already an old idea or an archaic idea that's being remembered as much as it's being defended. And what Costin is talking about here as the nomos is the competing popular view, right? So when later on, for example, in a more strictly philosophical context, the same question arises in the somewhat more generic form, can virtue be taught? As this is the subject of one of Plato's dialogues. We're invited to see this not merely as an interesting question that occurred to somebody, but somehow the I don't know what to say, almost the historical detritus of a sort of struggle between two ways of life. But that's not evident to us from Costin's point of view unless we can actually excavate this as a kind of, I don't know what to call it. I mean, you could think of it as a class conflict, but also perhaps almost as a race conflict. And that is not a story that is going to be laid out directly in the philosophy, thus the need for this as Spergler says, anthropological excavation.
Something I was thinking about, sorry, I'm out of breath, I'm working out while I'm listening to you guys, but what Charles was saying with the revealing, hidden and hiding and revealing, nature hides itself. Isn't this exactly what Costin is talking about? Is this exactly his thesis of what philosophy is, or what Platonic philosophy is? And yeah, I was going to say something about what you just said, Alexander, but I'll just leave it there because I can't breathe. Whew.
That was like a report from the front lines there.
I like that nature hides itself. Upcountry suggesting that later on, when philosophy is abstracted, when it's forced to defend itself from the charges of teaching tyranny, but also has to sort of esoterically, pass along the same lessons. It's hiding itself.
Right, and I just thought of it because of what Alejandro said, how we're already seeing it in Pindar. And, Costin's thesis about Plato kind of taking up the role, or Socrates rather, or whatever, taking up the role of protecting the idea of Physis. And, it makes you wonder how far, if you look back, where you'll find it. Because if we're already seeing traces of it in Pindar, I mean, how do we know he wasn't already? I mean, I guess we do. And then we look back even further to Theognis, But the only thing else I was thinking was, I don't want to jump ahead. I can't remember if it's in this chapter or not, but there's a really interesting part where Costin talks about Socrates' first use of the word regime. And it was in Alejandro's introduction to the space here. He mentioned something about it. This is the birth of philosophy. So when we're talking about Physis and this blossoming, coming into, issuing itself into being, Costin, we should always have to keep in mind philosophy and just what that means. And it was just something I was thinking of because we hadn't really brought it up, probably because it doesn't come up too much in this chapter yet.
Yeah, let me just say something about this, because I trotted out the nature loves to hide as the translation of that Physis, Cryptostide, Philae from Heraclitus, that it's the one I've got memorized. But as with any of these, it's not at all clear sort of ultimately what he meant and how it should be translated. And I was reading a little bit about this because I was thinking about what are some other contemporary notions of Physis. And one discussion I read talks about a use of this verb kryptein being used for as a kind of euphemism, like at death the body is veiled or buried, and so it is hidden away. And so you get this very Heraclitean sort of tension between the living and the dead, right? So one of the variant sort of translations that you could get would be something like, whatever makes things appear makes them disappear. That's too wordy to be a translation of Heraclitus, but I'm just trying to give you the meaning. What causes birth causes death. And so to put it back in this conversation, again, instead of thinking of the disappearing or the hiding in an abstract register, it might make most sense of it, right, to have a conception of the kind of glory of the living body, especially the athletic young body, at least for a thinker like Heraclitus, flips over into a conception of its end, its death. And similarly with the conversation about heredity, right, there is that kind of, well, you could think about it either as, right, even a young body in its glory can suddenly meet its death in battle or in the contest, but also just more generally, right, that glory is passing, right? And so the notion of heredity or blood starts to kind of push in this more abstract direction as that thing which sort of struggles against death or struggles against its own concealment, and we only really see or notice it in those moments where it sort of shows or shines forth. Of course, right, Pindar sort of centers the athletic achievement, at least in the, this is not the only thing he wrote about, but this is what the bulk of what survived. But one could take the notion in a more general way is what I'm trying to say.
Alejandro, shall we move to the later part of the chapter, which which sort of forms a bridge from the kind of bodily athletic arete to Platonic philosophy and politics and tyranny. And I'm thinking especially of Costin's discussion of what kinds of animal nature or what kinds of nature or spirit are best cultivated by these heroes and aristocrats.
Sounds good. So part 5 you're thinking of, or part 4?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Part
5.
He talks about the fox and the lion. The fox, I believe he associates the fox with is it phronesis, which is, I always thought of, going back to my undergrad days, of just knowing how to do stuff. And the lion is what, Andre something?
Let me take just this is great. This is where I want to land, Charles, but let me just take a step back, which is Costin is talking about this because he's introduced, this is the only non-ancient figure being discussed here. It's Machiavelli, right? And so there's this very interesting parallel or comparison between the sort of mythical Chiron, the centaur that's the teacher of the young, and this famous passage from Machiavelli, which actually he quotes 3 bits of Machiavelli, but let me just read one of them just to give people a sense. This one is on 143. Costin calls this an esoteric interpretation of the kind of Chiron style idea that the training must happen outside the city. You must know there are 2 ways of contesting, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse for the second. Therefore it is necessary for a prince to understand how to avail himself of the beast and the man. This has been figuratively taught by princes by ancient writers who describe how Achilles and many other princes of old were given to the centaur Chiron to nurse, who brought them up in his discipline, which means solely that, as they had for a teacher one who was half beast and half man, so it is necessary for a prince to know how to make use of both natures, and that one without the other is not durable. And then let me read the second quote from Machiavelli, just skipping Costine's discussion. Well, actually, I'll read a little bit from Costine. This is from 144. It could be said that Pindar, like Machiavelli, even goes so far as to explain which animal natures a man of nature must raise up from within himself to succeed. It is most interesting that Machiavelli continues above, so this is the continuation of the last bit I read. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand what they are about. Therefore a wise lord cannot, nor ought he to, keep faith when such observance may be turned against him, and when the reasons that cause him to pledge it exist no longer. And Costine continues, of course Pindar himself refers to just this example of the fox and the lion, and more than once, and he goes on, but suggesting that Machiavelli very likely did not just pull these out of thin air. But what's the turn that's been made there by invoking Machiavelli? Well, we've made this leap where now we're talking no longer about the survival of an archaic point of view in the poetry of Pindar, but it being in some sense rediscovered or rekindled in Machiavelli. And that seems to me a very significant turn in the chapter.
Yes, and he follows this up with a long translation from the fourth Isthmian Ode. He says that this passage concerns a race of leaders who have bred both the lion and the fox, war spirit and wisdom, Andrei and Phronesis, within themselves and for their offspring. Breeding and education to nature is then literally a rewilding, an animalization, a beastliness, a breeding of beastly character. So it's that's to kind of put points on what you were saying.
Right, and so Andrea, you could translate as manliness. Phronesis is a little bit more difficult to translate because it depends, I think, much more on the context. But let's just say, has sufficient wisdom to give good counsel. And so the idea that these, instead of being treated as highly developed human traits, are actually to have them, or at least to have the inborn capacity to develop them, is again something that is going to be treated as a result of breeding. Of course, training is still required, right? But the invocation of these totem animals of the prince is I think goes along these lines.
And the last few sections of the chapter are all about this kind of wisdom. Like we go from talking a little bit about, we go from talking about mostly Physis as this kind of nature energy that expresses itself in great deeds, to sort of what is the sort of inborn nature of the aristocrat, the leader, the king, what is the nature of the wise, how does the wise man the wise man is both wise from his own nature and also because he observes and understands nature as opposed to convention. And finally, I think it all sort of comes together toward the end of the chapter. Let's see where that is. Just reading here. We see that Pindar himself, though living firmly in the aristocratic world and at the height of the aristocratic world, recognizes, actually, that's probably skipping too far ahead. But I do like this quote anyway, so I'll read it. We see that Pindar himself, though living firmly in the aristocratic world and at the height of the aristocratic world, recognizes in some preliminary way that an aristocracy in great danger or at the point of its decline, on the edge of the civilized world and ever at risk of losing its liberties, produces, under emergency conditions, as the final product of its program of breeding and education, a tyrant. That is, a ruler who, unlike a traditional king, is outside all nomos, all traditional law and restraint, and who, although embodying the chief aristocratic virtues in their distilled form, blah, blah, blah. In other words, he is aristocratic Physis, radicalized and unbound. This is the origin of the genius bred for war. And then his twin, the philosopher, is what's discussed in the next chapter.
Sorry, what page were you just on, Charles?
159, the final paragraph of this chapter.
Gotcha. Okay. Let me just read something from a little farther back, and then let me just suggest we might just each do a round, whatever final comments we have. I think this will be a good kind of closing spot, since you read something from the end and Spurgler did earlier, and then we can see if folks have questions and so on. So I'm going to read. Unless I've lost my place. Oh, no, I haven't. So this is from 147. And he is reading Pindar's, I don't know which one of this is, but one of the poems in which the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece comes up. And Jason himself at once sent messengers everywhere to announce the voyage. Soon there came the three sons, untiring in battle, whom dark-eyed Alcmena and Leda bore to Zeus, son of Cronus, and two high-haired men, sons of the Earth-shaker, obeying their innate valor, one from Pylos and the other from the headland of Taenarus. You both achieved noble fame, Euphemus and wide-ruling Periclymenus. And from Apollo the lyre-player came the father of songs, much-praised Orpheus, and Hermes of the golden wand sent two sons to take part in the unabating toil, Echion and Eridus, bursting with youth. Swiftly came those that dwell around the foothills of Mount Pangaeon, for with a smiling spirit their father Boreas, king of the winds, quickly and willingly equipped Zetes and Calais with purple wings bristling down their backs. And Hera kindled in the demigods in all persuasive sweet longing for the ship Argo, so that no one would be left behind to stay by his mother's side, nursing a life without danger, but even at the risk of death would find the finest elixir of excellence together with his other companions. Here's Costine's commentary on this. This is the recreation of the primeval Monorbund, Moria, Comitatus, or in the Greek, Kouros, Ephebis, Hetaira, the society of young warriors mentioned already in the first chapter, the raw material or most basic form from which, as we will see, the philosophical brotherhoods and schools of a later time will take their form, as from an archetype. The story that may be recounted here regarding the relationship of Physis and Nomos would be roughly as follows. Conventional society is built on the lies of the usurper. Peleus, in this case, Agamemnon in the Iliad, both stand-ins for Nomos, the tribe, the collectivity, the many with their lies about good and bad. A young man of wild nature, Jason or Achilles, who has been bred for power and trained in the wilderness by Chiron, the man-beast, returns to claim his place as ruler by superior right, superior physical power and daring, and superior prudence or counsel in war. the false king, the suppressor and usurper of nature, Peleus Agamemnon, King Nomos, through trickery, perfidy, or cowardice, casts out the hero and his companions from the realm. The hero and his young companions are now an independent society of warriors or pirates, on the outskirts of society, superior by nature, but outside all law and custom. They undertake many hard tasks and adventures, loving danger and exhibiting contempt for mere life and for death. They return to take power as rightful rulers of their society or become rulers of a new society which they take by superior physical force and by trickery, often winning the daughters of the false kings. It is possible that in this drama of Jason or Achilles and of quite a few others, we see the survival in mythical form of the kinds of stories that actual bands of young warriors cast out from their tribes and societies and the ritual of the comitatus that existed in the deepest Greek prehistory, told among themselves to explain their outcast condition, their experiences, and even their final success after they became founders of new states. But it was for precisely this reason that in a previous chapter it was speculated that the concept of nature itself originates in part with this institution that uniquely first existed outside law and convention and subsisted by a principle totally different from this. I think that sums up not only what's being taken from Pindar, but much more so the sort of larger narrative and argument that Costin is making. So let me see if any of the guys have final remarks, and after that we can go to questions.
Yeah, I'll just say it's so funny. Pindar, it's almost like quaint when you think of the Greeks in that way, and that this is what he's like. He's trying to make it palatable for a genteel audience. It seems to me after.
Well, because at this point it's an old story, it's an old memory, right? And so Costin is sort of excavating and saying this has, anthropological truth to it, but there is something you could call almost like nostalgia at work here.
Yeah, exactly. And it just and it really comes through how it's just, even Pindar, so rich, is really just, he's just reflecting this one aspect out of so many of whatever this is, Physis, Arete, anything. But great talk, guys. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, I think that Charles may not be able to join us for the discussion, but hopefully he'll keep the space up. Spergler, you got anything before we hear from others?
No, let's go to questions.
All right, using my co-host powers, I'll bring up Stephen first. Stephen, nice to see you. Very happy you've been in the mix talking about this book in our spaces and other folks. Go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, outstanding space once again. Such incredible material. I just wanted to comment on that last bit from page 147 that you were talking about with Jason. So I have read this multiple times, and it wasn't until you went through that bit and read this that something occurred to me, and that is that this is, in a sense, the hero archetype. I mean, the thing that Joseph Campbell, rendered almost trite, almost a kind of cliche, with his notion of the hero's journey, and it's been so watered down that Hollywood uses it for mechanical script writing practically now. But this is like a very different view of that. This is like, showing a kind of anthropological background and contrast, really, when you bring in the whole Physis Nomos contrast to what's going on there. It just shines a whole new light on that basic hero's, kind of, exit and return. There's this exit and return pattern, exit from society, from convention, the various accomplishments, winning of glory and whatnot in return. This puts a very kind of specific, very kind of concrete flesh on those bones that's quite new and like really opened my eyes when you went through that.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I was thinking something the same, and yet I guess maybe the way to make this more precise is that it's the Mannerbund, right? It's not a single hero; it's a band. And I mean, obviously there are we can find many stories of that sort, but my understanding of the Campbell bit is that what is it? I was trying to remember this the other day, and someone reminded me. The monomyth is about a single hero, but I don't know. Maybe he says that's kind of irrelevant. Let me, if you don't have anything else, Stephen, let me bring up another speaker.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, thanks again, man. Okay, whenever you're ready, we'll go to Obtainer of Rare Antiquities.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so great job as always. Really well done breakdown of everything. I think an important thing to know is that there's a lot of comparisons between Physis and truth, in the sense that Costine talks about Physis in an individual as being inevitable, as once someone has it in them, it's going to manifest itself, it's going to come out inevitably, and this can't be stopped. And you talked a bit about getting to the core meaning of words at a literal sense before you start philosophizing about them. And in Greek, the word for truth is a negation of the verb lanthano, which means to escape notice of. So inherently, truth is something that cannot be escaped. It's inevitable. It's like a very inherent quality. And in many ways, it's the same as Physis, in how Costine describes it in this sense. So in chapter 3 and in the rest of the book, as he gets more into philosophy and Plato, it's important to note that Physis itself is basically being used as a synonym for truth, if that makes sense. And if you agree with that, that's just kind of my contention from the reading and from my own classical knowledge.
Yeah, no, this is good. Let me just say, I made that remark earlier in a sort of double way. One is just an observation about when I, do my own etymological research or try to rely on someone else's. This is often the case, that the more concrete, or if you like, embodied meaning tends to be the earlier, and anything that is brought into abstraction, the discussion happens, through a series of metaphors or analogies, or just the way that terms get stretched out in discussion. I would need to think a little bit more about what you're saying about aletheia there, just because the entire question, I guess, if you read someone like Heidegger, is whether we have a good enough translation of all the senses of aletheia in a word like truth. But I think when Costine says truth here, he is mainly leaning on just our ordinary English sense of truth, and we may be able to loop some sense of aletheia there. I would just say that term itself doesn't show up here. But thanks, man. So I've been alerted. Well, Charles already had to step aside, and Spergler's clock is running out. So we have. That sounds bad. I just mean it's late where Spergler is all I mean.
The radiation from the text message, it's getting to me. No, it's just late where I'm at, and I have a flight to catch in the morning. So.
Okay, well maybe if we have one more request, we can do that. I'll just watch for requests for a minute.
In the meantime, I guess my final remark might be something like it would have been nice if I think the beginning of this chapter had framed the importance exactly of Physis a bit more. I mean, maybe this was on me because I went like a week in between reading chapters, and perhaps I shouldn't have done this, but it just felt like understanding the exact importance of Physis and how it will end up relating into the birth of philosophy. It seemed like it gets developed near the end, but just in terms of like the framing, it would have been nicer if it were if it had appeared a bit more earlier on. Like he does mention how it's kind of like like philosophy and tyranny are kind of twin aspects of like this antinomian revolution, and how Physis is kind of at the heart of both. But it would have been nicer, I think, if this had been framed a bit better. I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think we can let Costin off the hook just in this particular sense that the responsibilities you have writing a doctoral thesis are different than when you're writing a book for I won't say general consumption, but let's say scholarly readers. And I think the very focused nature of the argument, even though it's wide ranging in other ways, but the fact that you don't get, I mean, I was telling you guys earlier, I went and read a bunch of stuff about uses of Physis and Heraclitus and other kind of figures that would have been earlier than Pindar.
Did you get to him in did you get to Physis and Hesiod at all?
Did not happen to come up in what I read.
All right, maybe I'll DM you. There's some interesting uses in the myth of the ages, which something I wrote pretty extensively about. But there's through the light of Costin's book, there's some interesting interpretation there.
Well, that sounds great. So it seems like maybe we're getting a sense this might be a good way to wind up our next space by kind of dwelling on Physis a little longer. So just to let everyone know, as we wrap up, we are planning to do 2 more spaces on the 3rd and 4th chapters on Plato and Nietzsche, respectively. Next one in probably a week, depending how everyone's schedules look. But thanks, Charles Spurgler, Upcountry, for participating, Stephen and Obtainer for your remarks, and everyone else for listening. Have a good night.
Hail Homer.
Yeah, hail Homer. Good night, guys.
Hail Homer.